Council members, you ready? Staff? Ready? Good.
Just for the mics and pumps.
Good evening, everyone. We'll call to order the special meeting of the Willows City Council for Wednesday, January 17th, 2024. Item 2 on our agenda, Pledge of Allegiance. Immediate past Vice Mayor David Bodden, would you do the honors, please?
I'd be honored. Thank you so much. Please stand. Salute, pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
Item 3, roll call. City Clerk, Amos Hoover, please.
Councilmember Thomas,
Here.
Councilmember Sprague,
Here.
Councilmember Vaughn,
Here.
Vice Mayor Hudson,
Here.
Mayor Hanson,
Here.
everyone present.
Thank you, Amos. Item 4, discussion and action calendar. All matters in this section of the agenda are discussed and will be acted on individually. Individuals wishing to address the city council concerning any of these items are invited to make oral comments of up to 3 minutes at this time. Please address your comments to the mayor and council members and not to staff and or the audience. When the mayor calls for public comment, please raise your hand to be acknowledged. While not required, the city requests that you please state your name clearly for the audio recording. And by state law, the council is not permitted to undertake any action or discussion on any item not appearing on the posted agenda. Tonight, this is a special meeting, so public comment will be restricted to the items on the agenda. This evening, there's one item on the agenda, item 4A, fiscal year 2023-2024 mid-year budget review, adjustment, general fund forecast, and potential sales tax measure. Is there any public comment tonight on that item? If so, please approach the podium. Any public comment? Nothing? Okay, thank you. Item 4A, fiscal year 2023-2024 mid-year budget review, adjustment, general fund forecast, and potential sales tax measure. Marty Brown, city manager, and Andy Heath, our financial consultant. Good evening.
Good evening. I'm going to pretty quickly hand this over to Andy. As you all know, Andy Heath is our finance consultant, and tonight's presentation is an action item also, a update to the fiscal year 23-24 budget. And Andy's going to be presenting to the council and answering all of your questions. Andy?
Thank you, Marty.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Thank you, Marty. As Marty mentioned, what I want to do tonight is actually go through a couple of things. We're going to look at the mid-year presentation, and that is kind of looking at the first half of the fiscal year and all of the financial activity that has transpired in all of the city funds for the first 6 months of the year. Along with that, we'll be looking at the financial forecast and exactly what's going to be transpiring in the general fund specifically over the next several years to the extent something doesn't change. Bringing the mid-year to you this early in the game in January is very rare. Typically, a city will wait until February or March, mostly March, to really wait for that first payment of property taxes to true them up, okay? To make sure that your property taxes as budgeted are going to come in, knowing that you only get your first property tax payment sometime in late January. This city has not received the property tax payment from Glenn County yet. So we kind of don't know what that's going to look like. However, based on what was received last year, and a conservative estimate that was used in the current year budget for property taxes, I'm pretty confident that we'll get exactly what was budgeted. I wanted to bring the mid-year to you tonight because I wanted you to see exactly where things were going, given some of the changes that have happened in the last 6 months, specifically with the Glenn County Sheriff contract and the city for the provision of the law enforcement services. That has a significant impact on the city's general fund. So I trued that up in the general fund as part of the mid-year. Looked at some other things based on the experience to date, and that's why we're bringing the mid-year to you tonight instead of in March. We probably, however, will come back in March and true the budget up again once we know exactly what property taxes are going to be, which again, I don't expect will be significantly different than what's in there now. Let's go back one slide. Yeah, okay. As part of tonight's discussion, I'll give you an overview of the mid-year budget review process. Then we'll look specifically at the general fund revenues and expenditures, and in the forecast associated with the general fund. We're going to spend some time on the forecast, and what that forecast looks like, because it's not pretty. Then we'll talk about the general fund deficit mitigation, and some of the things that your council may be able to do to mitigate the ongoing systemic deficits that currently exist in the general fund that are significant. Then we'll look at the city's enterprise funds, and really there's only one enterprise fund that's worth talking about, and that is the sewer fund, because the water fund hopefully sometime this fiscal year will go away. And then there's other fund groups, special revenue funds, and impact fee funds, those sorts of things. We'll spend a little bit of time on that, and then we'll open it up for any questions you might have. Okay, mid-year budget review process. So one of the things that we do is we actually look at what happened last year. As you're all probably aware, city auditors did come in a few weeks ago and began the audit. Really, there were no issues that were found during the audit, other than that the city has a significant deficit issue. Okay, so there may be a comment on that as part of the audit, and we'll wait to see if that actually happens. But we did have a conversation with the auditor about that. But I did true up all of the information for 22-23, specifically the fund balances that carried over into 23-24, based on what was actually presented to the auditors, and then any of the audit adjustments that were found. And there were like 6 or 7 of them that were small, that we had to add back to the trial balance that we provided the auditors. So the fund balances you're going to see for the start of 23-24, the current fiscal year, are probably pretty darn close to what's actually going to be in that audit as the ending fund balances for 23-24. Okay, so that's very important. Then we met with staff as required to obtain any updated baseline budget information for 23-24 that may have been different from what was actually proposed and ultimately adopted by your council in June. So there were a few of those. Incorporated any new developments into the budget, like the public safety contract, and the changes that happened there, and any grant carryovers. So there were a couple of grant carryovers that we anticipated last year, but we moved into this year knowing that we're going to get the grant. And again, most of the grants cover the expenditure in their entirety. So there's really no issue there. I just need to move the funding. Then we reviewed revenue trends and forecast impacting the budgeted funds. All right, looking at the general fund as a whole. So when we adopted the budget, using just under $700,000 in reserves. So your council, when you adopted the budget, were very well aware that the city had intended in its general fund for the current year to use just under $700,000 in reserves to balance your budget. We had $5.6 million in revenues, offset by $6.3 million in expenditures. As it sits today, given the adjustments that have been made, which we will go over, the budget sits on the revenue side at just under $5.9 million. So we're adding about $265,000 in revenue since the budget's been adopted. And on the expenditure side, about $6.8 million in expenditures. We're adding just over $500,000 in expenditures to the general fund since it's been adopted. So now, 6 months later, 6 months into the budget year, halfway through, instead of anticipating that we're going to burn $700,000 in reserves, we're now anticipating we're going to burn just under $1 million in reserves in the general fund. Okay? And we're going to go through the why. Okay, on the revenue side, I mentioned that we're increasing revenues by about $265,000. So property taxes, again, a conservative estimate. I increased that estimate based on what was received last year by about $23,000. Not a whole lot. But again, I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to achieve that number. Similarly, a component of property taxes is the in lieu property tax that we receive for former BLF money. So another $3,600 there. Encroachment permits are coming in a little bit higher than anticipated so far year to date. So we can add another $10,000 there. Interest earnings. So as we all know, over the last year, interest rates have skyrocketed. Went way up. They're coming back down a little bit, but they're still high. Okay. And as a result of that, what we're earning on on our idle cash. And then in the investment account that we do have is significantly more than what we were earning in the past. So another 5,000 there for the general fund. We carried over $139,000 for a public works equipment grant that your fire chief was able to procure through the USDA. That amount was supposed to be spent and then ultimately brought in last year, but it actually happened this year. So no issues with the timing. We just need to move the funding on both sides of the equation. So this is the revenue side. ARPA funding transfer. So this is money that actually comes from a special revenue fund where all of the ARPA money was received. Okay. And as that ARPA money was spent, you can recognize it as revenue and transfer it into wherever it was spent. So this year we anticipated using ARPA money for an array of different things. And I'm lowering that transfer by $170,000 because 200,000 of that money was supposed to be used for the pool upgrades. And my understanding now that you have another grant that's going to actually pay for the pool upgrades. So you don't need that $200,000 out of ARPA anymore for that. And then I increased the ARPA funding transfer by 30,000 for the master fee schedule update, which was inadvertently left out. That was previously funded by ARPA when we did the original budget in June. So 200,000 minus 30,000 increase is $170,000 decrease in the ARPA. The vehicle license fee residual payment, that just was inadvertently left out of the budget as well. That's an ongoing payment that we receive from the state for BLF residual payments, the 6,500 there. Sewer admin fees and transfers, and we're going to go over these. The slide specifically for this. We're adding $109,000 coming in from the sewer fund into the general fund for administrative fees and transfers for costs, indirect costs that are actually incurred by the sewer fund for the use of general fund staff and other things, and we'll go through that. Weed abatement, $5,000. We're seeing an increase in actual collections there. And then transfers increase of 135,000 there, and this is all related to the library. $100,000 is coming from a health department grant specifically for the library. And then another $35,000 has already come in for an increase in the allocation from Glenn County to the city for its library function. There will be a slight increase in expenditures. A lot of these revenues are being used to offset what would otherwise be general fund costs. But there were some like print materials and the such, and we'll go through that on the expenditure side that were added because we got an extra $135,000 for library purposes. Not a lot of changes again. So when we look at what I mentioned, where we have the $109,000, just under $110,000 increase in the sewer fund. This is the entire array of sewer fund cost allocations that will actually, hopefully, come into the general fund. And I'll just go through this. So it's presumed, and it's actually known, that an array of staff members in this city actually spend time or either managing or directly working with activities in the sewer fund. So your head management, your city manager, community development director, your finance analyst, accounting manager, city clerk, your fire chief, and then your public works employees spend a percentage of their time actually working in the sewer fund. So what we've done is I've worked with the city manager to determine what those percentages, at least from an eyeball perspective, should be. And this is consistent with the way it's done in just about every other city. I know no other city that has enterprise funds, robust enterprise funds that are viable and operational that do not allocate a portion of the time from the general fund to those funds. Fact of the matter is, you've got an audit going on that is your sewer fund is part of. You've got management and budget preparation for sewer fund activity that the sewer fund is part of. You've got the actual management of the staff associated with whoever is working with the sewer fund that management is responsible. You have a contract to the extent you actually contract out your contracted services associated with the sewer fund that management is managing. So you have, there are expenses that your city has never collected for up to this point, okay? You had a very small municipal number, and I want to say it was like $34,000 or $39,000 that was built into budget year after year after year that nobody can come up with an accounting for. Okay, I have no idea where that came from, nor is it enough to cover some of these costs when you actually consider what individual employees and or what individual functions that rely or that lie in the general fund are actually doing for the sewer fund. Outside of staff, you have a finance consultant. So if you had a finance director, your finance director would be up in the staff, but because you don't, you have a finance consultant that's down below. You have an audit cost. So a portion of the audit, a major portion of the audit is for the sewer fund. And the auditors spend a considerable amount of time in that because it's a big fund. City hall utilities and building maintenance, legal. No legal costs are charged to your sewer fund. Okay, that's just not, it's not appropriate. Information technology, your IT costs, citywide IT, no portion of that is charged to your sewer fund. Okay, so it does make sense that the sewer fund should participate based on these costs that are incurred from a citywide perspective. Okay, the total of all those costs, when you add them all up, it's about $261,000. And what I also want to point out on this slide is that on the bottom of the staff, you see Public Works employee costs where it says actual time only. So the way the budget is set up in the general fund is we've actually allocated 25% of the 5 or 6 individuals that work in Public Works to the sewer fund from a staff perspective. But having said that, because Public Works directly work with sewer, they actually track their time. Okay, and I get a true up at the end of the year. And the very first year I got a true up was last year. Okay, where I actually move that time at the end of the year based on the amount of time that they spend in the sewer fund. And last year we budgeted 25%, but it only came in at about 14. Okay, so it's still budgeted at 25%, but ultimately when we actually do this transfer, either periodically or at the end of the year like we did last year, we will only transfer from staff from those true direct staff costs, the actual amount that's actually worked. So that's the only staff cost that's direct. So it could be a little bit lower than 261 that's transferred, but that's what is actually being recommended now to be built into the budget. All that's built in right now is the 115, 215, and then that $39,000 small amount. The difference of which is that $109,000 that we're adding to the sewer fund. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. And I'm sure there'll be questions on that at the end, but that's the sewer fund that's coming into the general fund. Okay. When we look at the increase in appropriation, so this is the expenditure side of the equation in the general fund. I mentioned that we added about $525,000 in expenditures in the general fund. You're going to see that the largest component of its expenditure is your public safety contract with Glenn County. But on an incremental basis, the city manager's office is being increased by $84,000. And that's only because the finance department is being reduced by $91,000. So you have a swap of costs there because the city clerk position is now resident in the city manager's office from a departmental perspective. So it used to be in finance when we did the budget. For this year, we actually put it in finance. So I got to move that from finance into the city manager's office because that's where it's being charged. So that's pretty much just a swap out there. In planning, we're saving about $37,000. We did have a vacancy for a few months in the planning department for the community development public services director. So we'll save about $37,000 this year for that. Next slide, please. In the citywide, the general office, savings of about $3,300 there, lower expenditures. We have the addition of unbudgeted retiree health. So we have to pay a small component for retiree health to offset those costs. We had to add back the property tax administration fees and the League of California Cities costs. And that's because the community development fund or community discretionary fund, I'm sorry, doesn't have enough money to pay for that this year. So we have to move that back into the general fund. And then we did have lower general liability and workers' comp costs. So when we anticipated certain costs for general liability and workers' comp, those actually came in a little bit lower, which is a good thing. So overall, in citywide general office, we're saving about $3,300. Civic Center, just under $12,000 increase, higher utilities costs. And then we have that offset by the elimination of part-time staffing for a custodian position that is now contracted. It's in a contract position that we just eliminated the part-time staffing line out of the staffing side. Building, very small true up of labor costs there, $560. Here's your big one, police. So this is the higher contractual cost with Dunn County Sheriff Office, just under 400,000 additional costs, which is a real cost. Engineering, 19,175. We have higher costs there. Some of those costs are offset by increased revenues. And what I would like to do is, and I say this all the time with engineering, is really review those costs that are coming in and being incurred in the general fund to see whether or not we have the ability to charge those out to other funds if they're for certain projects that are in them. Typically, your city engineer is pretty good about that, but I still think we should go back and check. Library, and again, this has to do a lot with that library grant that I mentioned, both from the health department grant and then the additional allocation that's coming in from Lynn County. $26,000 increase in library, and that's for trued up staffing costs because you now have a full-time children's librarian. And also the additional allocation of $19,000 for print materials that is funded by the. Okay, moving forward with more appropriations. So Parks and Recreation, we decreased by $56,000. And that decrease is because you may recall when we adopted the budget in June, we actually had a full-time recreation manager that was approved as part of that budget. And now we're eliminating that full-time recreation manager at mid-year. So that position is never filled. And we're recommending that it not be filled. Swimming pool reduction of $300,000 there. And you might recall that the entire swimming pool upgrade project was actually budgeted in the general fund, and it had two sources. Those two sources were $200,000 from the American Rescue Plan Act fund, the COVID money that you received, and then another $100,000 coming directly out of general fund reserves. So we're eliminating that by $300,000 because that is now, from what I understand, funded by a grant that is going to cover that entire project. Parks and Public Works increase 11,829. These are just chewed up staffing costs. These are just staffing costs that change from what we budgeted to today, either because of PERS increases and or because of COLAs that have been provided or step increases. So small amount there. Fire, increase of 54,000, and that is related to weed abatement overtime. The fire department does have a grant through CAL FIRE that is specifically taking care of a lot of weed abatement activities. So you have not only an increase in contractual costs associated with that weed abatement activity, but also with the overtime that's being incurred by the firefighters that are participating in that as well. And then you have chewed up staffing costs in the fire department as well. 54,000 there. One more. And then increase of $426,000 in non-departmental. So there are a few one-time things here, and I'll go through what each one of these is. So we have the addition of debt service for the fire truck lease. So that fire truck lease debt service, which has 2 more years worth of payments on it, was coming out of the fire impact fee fund. But this year, you will exhaust your fire impact fee. There will be no more impact fees in the fire department to cover the remaining cost of that truck. So the balance of that payment, or $63,000 in the current fiscal year, will need to come from the general fund. So that's part of that. Then you also have, similarly, the debt service for a gap loan that was entered into the city, I think 4 or 5 years ago. That actually funded and bridged a cash issue for certain projects that were being undertaken. I think one of the projects was a Basin Street project that was funded by an EDA grant. And then you had Rumiano Cheese that was funded by a CDBG grant. So because of the cash flow issues with those and because of the unknown amounts of the grants that were going to be received versus the project cost that actually went out, there was a gap loan taken for about $700,000. And over time, as those grants were paid down and the projects were paid off, you had additional grant monies that actually were used to pay that debt service. All those grants are closed out now. Okay, so you still have about $250,000 to $300,000 of this gap loan that remains to be paid. That will also need to be paid by the general fund. Okay, so this year, that gap loan payment is $167,000. And I've added that back to the general fund as well. Capital appropriations for a dump truck. So you've got $150,000 there. And again, that's just the movement of that grant money. From just like we moved the grant money on the revenue side, we have to move the expenditure on the expenditure side. So that's that money that is coming from the USDA. And then you might recall that that was $139,500 that we added. So the difference is being funded by ARPA. And then a transfer out to Fund 347. 347 is an old CDBG fund, CDBG project fund that required monitoring of the actual activity that transpired in that fund. There are no more sources coming into the CDBG fund, but there are monitoring costs that were incurred and paid for in prior years, and these are mandated monitoring costs that must be done. To the extent the CDBG activity and delivery and or program income cannot pay for monitoring costs, the general fund must incur that cost. So that's what this transfer is for $4,469. So that makes up the 426. Assuming that we burn just under the $900,000 that you saw on the slide a few slides ago in the general fund, this is what your reserves will look like at the end of the year, current fiscal year. You'll have just over $1 million in reserves. That $1 million only represents 14.9% of your general fund expenditure base. I will inform the council that the minimum recommended amount that the Government Finance Officers of America, GFOA, recommends that cities have is 2 months worth of expenditures. That's 17%. Okay. You do not have that. What I would recommend for a city your size is that you have between 30 and 40%. So you basically have about half of the amount that you need to have in reserves to offset things that might transpire in the future that you ultimately might need to pay for. So your reserves are dangerously low at this point. And if you do spend $900,000 more in general fund expenditures than you bring in the current fiscal year, you will only have $1 million left in the general fund. So that parlays over to the general fund forecast on the next slide. And assuming that we look at what is called a base budget concept, meaning if I look at all of the services in the general fund, okay, that you currently provide, that are ongoing types of services, knowing that you have to provide law enforcement services, knowing that you have to provide fire services, knowing that you have to provide for things like building inspection, you have to have a planner, you have to have a city manager, you have to have an audit, you have to have a lot of different things that are mandated by the government code that you need to undertake each year that typically are funded almost entirely by your city's general fund, unless there is some cost transfer that you can do from funds that participate, like the sewer fund. If you look at a base budget concept where you take all those services from an ongoing perspective and what it's going to cost into the future each year, and you offset those by ongoing revenues, okay, that you know are going to continue to come in your general fund, things like property tax, sales tax, transient occupancy tax, a level of permit activity, a level of franchise fees for garbage, cable, water, whatever you charge franchise for, your recreation fees, those sorts of things. All of those things make up a revenue base that you have. Okay, and because you have those services that you charge fees for, and or you have discretionary revenue sources coming in, like taxes, or franchise fees, those are part of your ongoing revenue base. If you look at that ongoing revenue base, and then similarly, you look at the ongoing expenditure base for the services you currently provide, and you parlay that out into the future under a given set of assumptions for growth on both the expenditure side and the revenue side, this is what your forecast looks like. You can see here that you have a systemic issue over the next couple of fiscal years of about $1 million. Okay. Then that grows to just over $1.25 million the year after that. And that's because in fiscal 25-26, your law enforcement contract increases by another $300 and something thousand. Okay. That is currently in place. So the bottom line is, this is completely not sustainable. Okay. And your council needs to understand that this is the reality that your general fund is facing right now, under what's going on in your general fund today and what is exactly transpiring in your general fund today in terms of the services you are providing, how much they cost, which is a real number, and then ultimately what you're bringing in to offset those costs. Okay. Revenues are what they are. There's only so much revenue that you have. And ultimately, you may need to augment your revenue in some way, which I would recommend. If you don't augment your revenue, you need to reduce your expenditures. And to reduce your expenditures, you're going to need to look at those base expenditures that I just explained and what you have the purview to reduce, or what your council and your community is willing to accept to reduce. But this is the reality. Without doing something different, you will run out of money in your general fund at the end of next year. That's the bottom line. So if you go to the next slide, this is your CalPERS costs. So I just want to show this slide. You don't have as much of an issue as some other cities are having,
Big jumps.
but you do have an issue. Okay. So the CalPERS slide shows you 3 different bars for CalPERS. And I'm just going to get up and show you.
Andy, can I ask you to do me a favor? Andy?
What?
May I ask you to do me a favor? I just got the voice in my appliances that you share. with- Okay, just said my batteries went dead. Can I ask you to speak up or speak more
Yeah.
closely?
Okay. Do you want, so I wear hearing aids too.
I know.
Do
That's
you want
why
to change your
I-
batteries?
Why you can
Go ahead.
appreciate what I'm,
I'll wait for you because I know.
okay. My batteries are dead.
Okay,
so-
okay, good. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to show on this slide is there's 3 different buckets of CalPERS costs. Okay. You have the blue bucket, which represents the normal cost, and this is what you pay for active employees. So all of your active employees the city pays a percentage of payroll for those active employees. And you can see that doesn't fluctuate a lot because you haven't added a lot of employees. Okay. You just have a pretty static employee cost. This orange bar represents the unfunded liability that was previously paid to CalPERS before you did the bond. Okay. So we used to pay to CalPERS a fixed amount. That amount, as you might recall, fluctuated greatly, and it was very dependent on how CalPERS did in its investment portfolio from year to year. Very dependent. Not only was it dependent on how they did on their investment portfolio, but it was dependent on a lot of the policy things that CalPERS had in place or has in place that they change all the time. They do modification factors every 4 years, where they look at how long people are living, what age they're retiring at, how much they're making, their longevity, all these things that ultimately always increase the amount that is required from cities. And then they also do different things where they look at amortization of the UAL, where a few years ago they implemented, instead of just a straight line amortization, a ramp up for 5 years, straight line for 10 years, and then a ramp down. But the bottom line is those first 5 years, when they have an investment loss and you have to amortize that into what you need to pay ultimately, it's going up 5 years in a row. Okay. And it's just very bizarre the way CalPERS does business. But anyway, the biggest impact here is whether or not they make their discount rate, their investment return. And that discount rate today is 6.8%. And when they don't make 6.8%, then you get more of the orange, okay? Because they have to make that up. And they're only going to make that up in one way, two ways. They're going to charge a little bit more in the normal cost, not a lot, but they're going to charge a lot more to the employers in the unfunded liability costs. Okay. Your unfunded liability in fiscal 21-22 was refunded or bonded so that you could get a fixed rate instead of CalPERS variable rate, depending on what they made, and pay that over time. So that's what this yellow bar represents. So the orange bar was replaced by the yellow bar as debt service, okay? And you can see that's pretty much the same amount. Okay, it normalizes here. You had a few ups and downs because of the way the bond sale went, but now it's normalized. But what you'll see is starting next year, because CalPERS had 2 years in a row where they did not meet their discount rate, the last 2 years. So starting next year, and again, the year after that, you get the orange bar back. Okay, doesn't matter that you did the bond. Okay, that matters for this orange. Now you have new orange.
This is our new
Okay.
unfunded pension liability.
So that also needs to be added back to the equation. So this forecast includes, we're talking about a couple $100,000 here.
Well,
That's
didn't
been
it
added
jump
to the budget.
$5,000
Yeah, next year.
next year. So next year went from like a couple $1,000s to 85,000 overnight, 1 year.
But that's only if they hit their percentage that they set, correct?
I didn't hear you.
That's an estimated, right, that they hit, if they hit that percentage? If they fall below it, then the bond comes back in place or no?
No, they're two different things. We bonded against all the unfunded pension liability back in 21-22.
Right.
Paid off, a CalPERS, and then we have a set, steady, low interest rate bond for that. But over time, the unfunded pension, you have a new unfunded pension liability.
Yeah, what was happening
Okay.
before is that those first 2 bars of orange
Right.
was very volatile.
Mhm.
Okay, very volatile. That money, instead of being in a bond at a fixed rate that you were paying, it was held by CalPERS.
Right. So my
Okay,
question
if
is,
they
just as-
if they lost money on that, guess what?
We paid for it.
You went
right.
up more. Okay,
So the
now,
orange bars that you're showing though in the future years, those are set. Those are not estimates. Those are going to be actual costs that will come in or they
24,
estimate it.
25 is pretty much clear that it's happening.
that,
Andy's estimating the
that's
rest.
an actual number.
That's an actual
Okay.
number.
But those orange numbers come right out of their actuarial report. So if
They're
you pull up
projecting that.
the actuarial reports for CalPERS, they
Right.
will give you a forecast that's
Right.
pretty
Okay.
good, okay? And it's based on
Thank-
assumption. It assumes they're gonna earn their discount rate, 6.8% in their portfolio every year. If they don't, then that orange bar increases. If they make more, then it might go down a little bit.
Okay.
It assumes that your city is providing no more than 3% salary increases. Okay, if you provide more salary increases, that orange bar is gonna go up in 2 years, okay? If you
I just
provide,
wanted to make sure that we were talking, these are actual numbers and these are
yes,
Pretty
as
close.
pretty ballpark as accurate as we can get. Okay.
And keep in mind, the orange, the unfunded pension liability, for the most part, are classic CalPERS employees. If you recall maybe that former Governor Brown changed the entire CalPERS structure back in 2011, 2012, and made a new category called PEPRA. Most of PEPRA, I'm a PEPRA, they pretty much pay for it as it goes along.
Right.
This unfunded pension liability are the old system for the most part, of classic CalPERS employees. And in the city of Willows, we actually don't have that many classic CalPERS employees.
on the
But
PEPRA.
you are also paying for people who've left the city,
Left.
who were classic and now work for another city, maybe at a higher salary. You have to pay that differential.
You're paying your share.
Yeah.
Yeah. For whatever service they provided you. Okay, next slide. All right, so assuming all that comes to fruition, okay, on the forecast side, that we continue to burn $1 million a year, then start burning 1.2, 1.3. This is what your reserves look like. You can see in 22, 23, 24, you start with that's current fiscal year, just $1 million, okay? And then at the end of the year, you're gonna go down to, you'll go down to $1 million, and then at the end of next year, you're gonna go down to 53,000. So that's basically zero.
Yeah, it's less
Okay.
than 1% reserve.
Okay, so, and then in 25, 26, you start eating eating money in other funds, or basically cash you don't have in the general fund. This is if you don't do anything. Okay, this is if nothing's done to change this picture, either on the revenue side or on the expenditure side. But something needs to change. Okay, it just has to, because otherwise you're just gonna run out of money.
Andy, excuse me, Andy, at one point, when does bankruptcy become the solution or the reality?
We don't have enough debt for bankruptcy.
So how do we operate when we spend more money than we have?
Disincorporation would be.
Disincorporate?
Dire, but that's, I don't, because we don't really have that much
Well,
debt.
the
to-
forecast
for
never
bankruptcy.
goes back. It goes down, 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 down. I know the solution is fixing the problem, revenue or expense side, which we know expense side is not a fix. I don't see any fix in that side at all, but the revenue side.
Yeah.
So anyway, so when we no longer have a general fund, we no longer meet the requirements of the state or the expectations of whatever agencies look at us, our bond ratings go to heck in a handbasket, and we're no longer financially viable.
That's all true.
That's true.
Yeah.
That
Okay.
could happen.
Okay, next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about general fund deficit mitigation. So what I put up here is just what a transactions tax, also known as a TUT, a transactions and use tax, otherwise known as another component of sales tax, would mean to this city. So we had HDL, the city's sales tax consultant, actually help us. Are you hearing me okay? Okay, I
Fine,
want to make
just
sure.
Barely.
Okay. Actually had HDL do a forecast for us on what that TUT would look like on an annual basis. And then what I did was I actually only took 90% of that. Okay. So I want to be as conservative as I can be in looking at when I'm putting numbers in front of your council. Okay. So assuming that you did a TUT and you put that on the November 2024 ballot, you would have that TUT be active in April of 2025, okay? Because you need to, number one, sales tax or a component of a sales tax can only start at the beginning of a quarter, calendar quarter. And then you need at least, I think, 60 or 90 days before you can actually implement that tax to give CDTFA, the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, the time they need to implement it. There's all kinds of resolutions that need to be done and all that kind of stuff. So, but assuming that a ballot measure was put on and adopted in 2024, November of 2024, it would be effective April 2025. 1% for an entire fiscal year, okay, not a quarter, an entire fiscal year would be just under 1.4 million. 1.25% tax, 1.73, 1.5% would be about 2 million. And then 1.75% tax would be 2.7 million. Okay. So when you look at, so what I did was I took the deficits for each year, starting next year in 24-25 on what the systemic or actually the deficit is for that year as on that forecast. And you can see that under a no tax situation, that is status quo, that next year you burn that $1 million, that 968, then it goes to 1.2, 1.2, 1.3. If you implemented a 1% tax, and you implemented that in April of 2025, you're going to have 1 quarter in fiscal 24-25 that's actually going to be receiving that tax. So your $968,000 deficit goes down to a $621,000 deficit for that year. But then immediately starting the next year, you are back in surplus mode for 145, 182, and then 80,000 in 27-28, and that's because you have an issue with the contract with the sheriff and also the UAL payment going up. And then you can see what a 1.5% tax does. So 1.5%, that puts you, in my opinion, in an area where, you know, you have room to do the different things that I think your council wants to do in the future. So I mean, this is what it looks like and what I've also done each year. So starting in 25, 26, I've added 2% to the amount of tax because sales tax grows for the most part from year to year. So I increased it by 2%, and that's what that 2% annual growth in tax means. But this is the reality. I mean, a revenue measure like a TUT, transactions and use tax, could help this city significantly. There are so many other cities, and I want to say in the last general election cycle, there were 90 cities in California that considered a TUT, and I think all but 2 or 3 passed. Okay, so this is extremely common from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, recognizing that there are just certain cities that have either a geographical challenge or an economic-based challenge that need to sustain themselves from a general fund perspective, and this is what they're looking at. 2 years ago, it was because of CalPERS. Okay, a lot of these cities were actually implementing these things because they thought their UALs were going to go through the roof. Okay, and a lot of them did. But a lot of them, like your city, bonded for that. And then CalPERS had a really good year. And this year, for example, we didn't pay any UAL costs, 0. But it's returning next year because in the last 2 years, CalPERS lost money. So you're up against a lot of obstacles. All right. And I think that you need the room, like at least a 1% tax, if not a 1.5% tax. You need the room to be able to do the different things you want to do and have the comfort that you know, at least from a base budget perspective today, ongoing revenues less ongoing expenditures, you're going to have a surplus if you have a 1.5% tax in place. Okay. All right, next slide. Okay, now I'm going to quickly go through the other funds as part of the mid-year because I know there's probably going to be a significant amount of discussion on everything I've talked about so far in the general fund and the forecast. So let's just drill through these really quick. There's not a whole lot of changes in the other funds. In the sewer fund, so you had an adopted budget of 1.8 million in revenue, 2.2 million in expenditures. The only thing that's changing really in the sewer fund is we're adding just under $2 million in cost to the general fund side. And all of the costs that's being added is related to capital. And it's capital that you're required to do, consistent with the money that was received as part of the bond issue 2 or 3 years ago now, maybe, that actually was put into the bank. So there's a significant amount of money in a reserve account right now, a restricted reserve account that can only be used for sewer capital. About $4 million is in that fund, earning a lot of interest too, by the way, which is good because you can do more projects. But we added about $2.3 million consistent with the CIP, the Capital Improvement Program plan that was updated by your city engineer. So I took that plan and actually built in everything that he had, at least on the docket, for trying to start it sometime this year into the budget. So that's the only change basically that we have here. I do have a number in the sewer fund on that last bullet called net margin. Okay. And what I like to do for enterprise funds is just show exactly what's going on in the enterprise fund, like the general fund forecast, from an ongoing perspective. So if you look at the ongoing revenues, which in the sewer fund are essentially only the rates that are paid and the interest earnings that are earned on the cash that's in that fund, and you subtract the ongoing expenditure, which is basically everything except for capital. So it doesn't include capital because that's considered a one-time cost. That's called your net margin. And typically that should be positive in an enterprise fund. Otherwise, that too will have a systemic issue, which is why you raise rates over time. The net margin in the sewer fund is just positive at about $48,000. But keeping in mind that you still have a couple of years of rate increases programmed into the sewer fund, consistent with Q18 that was done like 3 years ago or whenever it was. So that net margin hopefully will keep pace with inflation. A lot of what's going on right now is I'm not sure when they did the rate study for the sewer fund, if they anticipated inflation being what it has been in the last year and a half. So that could have a lot to play they may have expected that margin to be a little bit higher, but I just like to show that to the city councils that I work with, so that you know. Okay, next slide. Water fund. So in the water, and by the way, in your staff report, I think I listed all of the capital projects that were added as part of that $2.3 million. Water fund, not a whole lot here. I think the goal this year is to 86 the water fund and transfer it over to Cal Water by taking a lot of what remains in the ARPA fund and using it for a Cal Water main tie-in so the city can get out of the water business. But no change in revenue, about a $29,000 recommended adjustment for expenditure side, and that's just to cover the deficit that currently exists in the water fund. Okay, so you've been spending more in the water fund than you've been bringing in rates, which is just the reality of the situation over the last couple of years. So we're taking the ARPA money, a portion of the ARPA money, and actually transferring it for that to close out that fund. In your gas tax fund, next slide. Gas tax fund, so no change in revenue, really, about a $55,000 decrease in expenditures. That expenditure decrease, again, is just truing up the capital projects from what was anticipated at the beginning of the year to what now exists in the capital improvement plan that was, again, updated, so you can see what that is. At the end of the day, assuming we spend the $321,000 that is now being recommended, we'll still have about 134,000 in the gas tax fund. So that's a good thing. And again, these gas tax funds can only be used for street related purposes. Can't be used for anything else. Next slide. RMRA SB1. So this is the Road Maintenance Rehabilitation Act, otherwise known as SB1 money that comes in. So about 157,000 slated to come in. Increase the appropriation by $450,000 to $511,000. And that's because in the new CIP, you have a streets and sidewalk rehabilitation allocation in the CIP for $500,000. So I upped that from the original budget. And assuming you do that and pay for some residual costs for last year projects that were paid for by SB1, you'll have just under $3,000 left in that fund, which is fine. I mean, you want to spend that money for your streets, and that's what you're programming to do with this budget. Next slide. RSTP, the Regional Surface Transportation Program, or your STIP, which is your State Transportation Improvement Program Fund. So these are monies that come from both the federal government and the state government that can only be used like gas tax for street related purposes. Increasing the estimated amount to be received to $362,000 from $112,000. And that's basically to account for monies that have been received this year related to projects that were completed either this year or last year. So it's just the timing of the receipt of the grant. If that money isn't received within 60 days after the close of the fiscal year, I have to move it from one budget to another because I can't accrue it back. So that's what's happening here. On the expenditure side, you had an adopted budget of 170. We're reducing that to 110, and that's because some of the projects were done in the last year, or the expenditures were incurred in the last year. Nonetheless, assuming all of this is done and all of it comes to fruition, you'll still have about $215,000 left in RSTP. That again can only be used for street-related purposes. But, okay, county library and literacy pass-through. These are two special revenue funds, and essentially all that's received in these funds or in this fund is two sources. So one of the sources is the direct contribution that comes from the county for the offset of the general fund expenditure in the library that's for the city of Willows. And then the other source is the annual money that we receive from the state of California, specifically for literacy programs that is passed through directly to the county. So all of that comes in, and then ultimately it's all transferred out to the general fund and or the county for literacy programs. So this is kind of an in and an out fund, but we do it this way so we can track exactly how much is being received and then ultimately transferred out. So we're receiving 151,000 more. And that is because we have the additional 15,000 or 35,000 in the allocation from the county. and then a grant from the health department for $100,000, and there was some additional literacy funds that were not budgeted that have actually materialized and make up the difference between those two amounts and the 151. All literacy funds are transferred to the literacy programs, and all library funding is transferred to offset the net library cost in the general fund. So, in and out. Next, please. These are some other smaller library funds that go to fund a specific purpose. So these are like special revenue funds. So you have zip books. We'll have about $733,000 in that fund. The NorthNet Training Fund, there'll be nothing in that fund because it's all being recommended to be appropriated, whatever is in there for a library purpose. And again, these three funds, it's only library stuff that you can do with these funds. And then the CLSA Delivery Fund, there'll be about $28,000 in that fund. So if we can find something eligible that we may use that money for, that would be the thing. 28,000 as of the end of the year compared to what's appropriated. Next slide. These are some miscellaneous funds. So I'm not gonna, the only one I'll call out is maybe the, well, I'll call out the top one, Certified ADA Access Fund. This is a portion of the business license that actually comes in that is specific to ADA improvements in your city. Can only be used for ADA activities. So you do have $13,000 in that fund to do something ADA related. Willows Lighting and Landscaping Fund. So this is money that comes in from a special assessment. It's actually put on the tax roll for participants in the 3, I believe, lighting and landscaping districts that the city does have. And those monies can only be used for eligible activities as discussed in the engineer's report from the city engineer that is adopted by your council every year before this actually gets sent to the assessor for inclusion on the tax roll. So, but you will have about $45,000 in that fund at the end of the day. Recreation
question.
reimbursement, recreation
a
cultural funds.
Real
Yes.
quick question on
Yep.
that one, Andy, so we don't have to come
Mhm.
back to it. We don't have a citywide lighting and landscaping fund, do we? We
I-
just have that just for that project over on the east. or west
Yeah,
side?
I don't think there's a citywide one. I think they're very defined areas.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
The recreation reimbursement and the recreation cultural fund are basically closed out. All of that, anything associated with recreation has been moved to the general fund. So I really have no idea why the city had these two funds in the past. But all the recreation activity is moved to the general. And then you have your community discretionary fund, which receives the money, the program income, to the extent it is less than $35,000. You can what's called defederalize those loan payments and put them for any use that your council desires. Your historic practice has been to move that money out of the CDBG home fund and into the community discretionary fund to use for things like LAFCO costs, to use for things like CDBG monitoring costs or contributions to nonprofits in the community, those sorts of things. So that's what this fund has been used for. The payments for the loans have gone down. So you're not able to do as much as you have done in the past with this fund, which is why we moved, I think, the League of California City Dues and one other thing to the general fund, as I mentioned earlier. But at the end of the day, after paying for a few things in this fund, like I think 3 cores in there and a couple other things.
LAFCO's payment.
Yeah, yeah. So $3,500 will remain in this fund. So I want to see where this fund goes to see if it's just people that aren't paying their loans and see if there's something we can do about that, or if just the loan payments have been, they're done. Mall maintenance. So to this day, I really don't know what's done in the mall maintenance fund. And I apologize for saying that, but I just don't know what it's used for. But there's $14,000 in that fund for whatever is done to maintain the mall, wherever that is. So, I don't know.
Across the street from Carp.
Okay. And there's really, over the last couple of years, there haven't been much expenditures in there either, so. State Recycling Grant Fund, you have about $8,900 there. And this is money that comes from the state that can only be used for recycling related purposes. And what I've seen a lot of cities do is in parks and things, they'll buy the garbage cans that have the separators at the top for certain recycling things or whatever. And that's a qualified use, for something like that. So, State Recycling Grant Fund, you do have about $9,000 in the next slide. These are your CDBG and housing funds, so there's no money in these funds, and ultimately, any money that is received for the loans that are in these funds is either transferred to the community discretionary fund that I just mentioned, and that would be your CDBG housing fund. And then in the home fund, there's really nothing due. All the loans are deferred, but if anything were to ever come in, if it's less than 35,000, you can transfer it to that other fund. But if it's more than $35,000, you can reloan it out, consistent with your reuse plan. Okay, which means how and what you actually loan that money for. Okay, but you don't have anything right now, so nothing there. Next slide. Okay, these are your project operating funds. So you do have an over-the-counter grant that was granted by CDBG for your Rumiano Cheese Company. They have actually started making payments back on this grant, okay? Not a grant, on this loan. And that money's coming back into the city. So at the end of this current fiscal year, you're going to have about $235,000 in that fund. This money can be used for future loans consistent with your reuse plan. I don't know what your reuse plan looks like, whether or not it's for strictly for businesses like this loan was for, or if it's for rehab or those sorts of things. But whatever that reuse plan says, you can actually work. I encourage you to work with a consultant if you're going to go down this road, but work with somebody to loan out that money to stimulate economic development and the things like that in the city. Typically a requirement that is put out by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which manages CDBG, is that you have to hire so many people for so many thousands of dollars worth of loans. So they really are encouraging employment and then economic development from that in reusing this money. If you don't reuse this money over time, they make you send it back to the state. Okay, so keep that in mind. Basin Street and EDA grant. So these are those two projects that I was talking about, or the two funds for that project that were associated with the GAP loan, in addition to the Rumiano Cheese Company. So they're closed out. So those, you won't see those anymore in the future. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. Project operating funds. Oh, wait.
No, next slide.
Next one. So, SB2 grant. So nothing there. That's all done. The USDA RDBG grant fund. So that winds down in this year as well. So there's nothing there that's going to be anticipated once it's closed out. Home grant, 16,826. So this accounts for some monies that actually some of this $16,000 may be able to be transferred to the general fund. I need to look at the documents to determine how much, if any, can be transferred to the general fund. But Sycamore hasn't made any payments yet because their loan is deferred. But I think the $16,000 has to do with what's called activity and delivery, which is a component that is typically part of any CDBG grant or home grant that the city gets to use for its admin and those sorts of things. So I want to confirm what that 16,000 is, and then maybe we can transfer all or a portion of it to offset costs. Or likely Karen, who put all of that in place. Next slide. Impact fees. So these impact fees can only be used consistent with AB 1600 and the governing documents to put the impact fees in place. Impact fees can typically only be used for new development and the expansion of service that is required as a result of adding new development. The anticipated fund balances at the end of this year, as of now, meaning I'm taking into account what's already come in, assuming that we don't spend anything unless it's recognized on here. At the end of the day, the fire impact fee fund will have 0, and that's because we used all that money for the fire debt service, fire truck debt service that now exists in the general fund. The police will have about $62,000. And I have talked with the city manager about exploring an opportunity to consider that money as part of the Glenn County Sheriff Office contract. And hopefully maybe be able to use that money to offset a portion of that contract to the extent they're buying new equipment, just like the fire department did, and or, doing something different associated with new infrastructure for the police operation here in the city. We have these funds, we contract it all out. Is there something that Glenn County is doing as part of our contract? I'm not talking about something new that we just give them the money and they go do something with it. I'm talking about our contract where within the confines of our $2 million contract that we have right now, and we take $62,000 and pay for something in that $2 million contract legally. So I think we need to explore that as an opportunity to save the general fund $62,000. Storm drain, 156. So library, we added $25,000 in the library fund or in the library impact fee fund, consistent with what's in the CIP. So if we spend that 25, we'll still have $119,000 in the library impact fee. Streets has 186, parks 339, and the I-5 interchange just under 400. And again, these funds can only be used for any Nexus-based project for expenditure.
Mr. Mayor, I have a quick comment on this particular item.
Yeah, Mr.
Yeah,
Sprague.
if I might.
Yes.
In regard to the police department, the $62,000, I would rather suggest that we take a look at that. If we're really headed to what we want to do is to reboot our own police force, I'd rather see us be able to use that money for that objective as opposed to offsetting some of the costs associated with the sheriffs.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Thank
Okay, on next slide, last fund. Okay, there's your COVID-19 ARPA fund, and this is the money that was received over 2 years in 2 different tranches that came in from the federal government through the state. Basically, there's no more revenue to be received, but we adopted a budget with $967,000 worth of COVID money that was going to be spent. We lowered that by 140, keeping in mind that there are two things that transpired here, 3 things actually. We lowered it by 200 because we took out the pool. And then we increased it by 30 for the master fee study. And then I added another $30,000 for the finance system upgrade. That, if we add another module, that'll cost more money. So to the extent ARPA money is available, we want to use that before we use general fund money. But assuming we do all that, we will still have about $264,000 in ARPA money at the end of the day. And I have also recommended to the city manager that to the extent the water system tie-in doesn't require any more money than is already allocated, and I think that's about $657,000. To the extent no more is required for that, because that's got to get done. If you still have $264,000 at the end of the day, that you use that towards your police contract, because ARPA money can be used for essentially any purpose, and especially public safety services. So that's just something that's out there as well. Let's see, next button. That's it.
Mr. Heath, real
So-
quick, Andy, real quick on that last comment, in reference to the ARPA fund balance, the $264,000. What's the sunset date on?
December of 2025.
December 2025.
So you've
Okay.
got another year and a half,
Okay.
or 2 years. Actually.
I also have a question on the ARPA while we're right there. If my math is correct here, you start out with 1,452,000 and some change. You have expenditures listed here that total 827,000. And then you have a remaining 264,000.
There were prior year expenditures. So
I'm
you have,
sorry?
you have to go back one more year.
One more year
Yeah,
for the rest
yeah.
of those expenditures,
Yeah.
because I see 360 some odd thousand
Yeah.
dollars. So you're saying we spent another 360,000 the previous year.
Correct.
I see.
You
Thank
got it.
Quick question on those ARPA funds. Can those be used to finish paying off the fire truck lease loan as well for public safety? Would that be an option for those?
What-
Can we use, the ARPA funds to pay off the fire truck?
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Again, that's just another right now general fund offset. So yes.
Andy, are you ready for questions from the council now? In reference to your, are you ready for
Ready for
questions now from the
questions?
council?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
very good. Gentlemen,
And just,
questions?
I've got my hearing aids turned
Okay,
up, so.
very good.
You could speak up. Yeah.
I don't wear them yet, but I will be soon, so I can appreciate it as well. So, all right, thank you very much, Andy, for that very detailed, excellent presentation. Members of the city council, who would like to begin with your questions? Mr. Sprague, would you like to begin?
Actually, I have, as I usually do, tabbed a bunch of this stuff. Andy was able to answer a couple of the questions that I had through here, and you actually created more questions I might have. I think in the time that we have here tonight, I'd much rather submit those questions through the city manager to you for a couple of reasons. My questions are a little bit complicated, and I'd like to memorialize the answers for those. So I'm going to pass on the opportunity to ask questions at this point and submit them in writing.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sprague.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas?
Well, I had a lot of questions, but I think you've answered most of them. We have the systemic operating deficit. So when I look at what our sales tax or our income from sales tax to our budget, it runs about 70%. The sales tax, occupancy tax, property tax covers about 70% of our operating budget.
Right.
What's the standard in a healthy city?
That is the standard.
70%.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I've seen. Yeah. So those
So
three
if that's the
sources
standard, and we're upside down.
and
I'm not,
it really depends on. Some cities have what's called a utility users tax, which would be difficult for you to implement.
Right.
Because it requires a vote. Trying to think of other major source that may.
but it's property tax, sales tax, and
those,
and the occupancy tax,
those are the big three.
and that works out to about 7% of our operating budget. And if that's standard in the industry, every city in the country should be, in the state should be the same way we are.
No,
No.
because it depends on what you're spending money on too.
I mean, our revenues here have been, Andy and I were talking about it earlier with, Councilmember Vaden, that the revenues in the city haven't really increased. I mean, they've just remained pretty steady for a number of years. And yet the cost and the expense of running a city, employees, salaries and benefits, the cost of equipment, all of that's increased over time.
I recognize cost of doing business. So we need to work towards solving that internally as far as getting more property tax, more sales tax, and that's all, growth we need to do, but that doesn't solve our current problem. I think sales tax is about the only way we can go at this point in time, but that's all I have at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Mr. Vaden?
Thank you very much, Andy. Very educational as well as informative. And thanks, Marty, for pointing out that the income stream for the city of Willows for the last 10 years has been $5 million. And that our inability to create new revenue streams, revenue sources, lies to me at the root of the problem. Because we know that PERS and all that cost goes up, and labor and materials and supplies and all of the above. We also know the population is flat for the city. But if we did have a big population growth, then we'd have to add staff and other kinds of services. So thanks for the sales tax methodology. I'm a big proponent of annexing additional land to the city of Willows, which can be the basis of revenue generation through growth and development. I would like to see us work hard on the revenue side. I would ask Andy, based on your long-term experience and with this city and others, what solutions in addition to sales tax other communities might be developing or using that are outside the box, if there are such answers possible tonight. I know that you're a contract employee, so the time you spend answering our questions costs us money. So I appreciate asking you these questions now while you're here on the budget, and hope that we don't burden you with a lot of expensive time as we proceed trying to find answers to what is, in my opinion, basically revenue, expenses, good luck. I think we run at the pretty close to the, well, actually way below the line, but, and we are at minimum staff. We, have a 3 square mile city, and yet we still provide services way beyond the city limits that we pay for, and so on and so forth. So, can you perhaps speak to what other cities might be doing, especially if it's outside the box? Just raising fees is simple, not simple, but that's the norm. That was a question.
I mean, he was wondering if we could think of anything else.
What else? What are
It-
other
it's-
people doing? I mean,
Out of
is,
the
is
box.
it just cities of our size that are having this
No,
problem?
You know, like city manager indicated, you have a fee study, that is gonna be coming, that's, for lack of a better word, I think that's gonna be de minimis to the equation.
Okay,
Given the size, of what you need to accomplish. TUT, transactions use tax to sales tax is the key, in my opinion. You know, looking at some level of economic development, I have no idea what that looks like in this city, okay? I'm not a planner, and I don't work in economic development. I can tell you the impacts of it, give me the numbers, but, you know, what would drive this economy to a different place, where more money is coming into the coffers of the city? I mean, that's for you and your planner and your community development and your city manager to really conceive, and try to come up with. But on the expenditure side, and you're right, I mean, there's a level of service that your council wants to provide to this community. And aside from that, there's a level of service this community is expecting, that this city deliver. What you cut out of that, or how you do things more efficiently, either, you know, through, and I hate using this, but doing more with less, was always a slogan in the past for every budget deficit I ever faced, you know, when I was an employee. And, you know, thinking outside the box and doing things a little bit differently, but people just need to put their thinking hats on when it comes to the expenditure side, because I just don't know what you can cut, on the expenditure side in this city without significantly irritating a contingent of your constituency.
well, you know, in addition to my emphasis on income, the solution often is raise fees and lower services. And I really don't want to lower services to the citizens of Willows, and that's been the campaign for the pool, even though it might be considered frivolous or outside the core needs. But it says to the citizens that we are doing something they can enjoy, and it's something they can see as a tangible value for living here and paying taxes here. Thank you, Andy.
You're welcome.
Anything further, David? Okay, okay, thank you. Mr. Hudson?
I just have a quick question here. As I'm going over these line items, I see that the swimming pool is costing us, we have it budgeted for $40,000 annually, and it's not operational. So what's that $40,000 actually going to?
So if we had last year, we contracted with the school district for the pool, swimming pool, so that we could provide, a swimming program last summer. We use the funds also to pay for lifeguards. They get paid. They're not volunteers. And the pool is open 6 days a week and half days when we're contracting with the school district. So it's like 1 to 5, Monday through Saturday. And so, you have to have lifeguards there for all those
So
hours.
those are the fees and the costs were associated when we are running the high school pool. Okay.
Correct. And last year, I believe the contract with the school district, I think we were charged around between 12 and 13,000 for our contract with them for the summer for 6 or 7 weeks.
Okay, and then my next question is, if we leave the rec department vacant, who would be the one running the swimming pool program?
Well, as you know, next week, there's going to be an item for the council to discuss how they want to proceed, since Christina Hudson has tendered her resignation and she's our part-time recreation manager. And so we would need somebody to do that. We would seek a contractor
Okay.
to run the recreation programs, including the swimming pool. Because as I've tapped all of our staff, no one here has any expertise.
Right.
in running recreation programs.
No, and I understand that. I remember we kind of discussed that a little bit, but my general question is if we do not do that, if we say no to that, then we're cutting both those costs out of our budget, correct? At least half of it for that, for the remainder of the year.
Are you asking what the savings would be by suspending recreation programs?
Correct, yes.
It would be about $60,000 a year, both swimming pool and all the rec programs, all combined, and salaries of a part-time person or a contractor, and all the part-time people who support. We just did the numbers today. I was working on the staff report with Joe. The numbers for both rec programs and the swimming pool, because they actually have they each have their own budget,
Mhm.
combined is about $60,000.
Mr. Mayor, I apologize, but Dave's question and Andy's response kind of reminded me of a couple of simple questions.
Go ahead,
that I
Mr.
had
Sprague.
on that. First off, on the third to the last page of the staff report here, regarding staffing. Under Department 60, planning, we have 5 full-time planning commissioners and 1 full-time community development service director. Does that suggest we're no longer having a contract planner, that Joe is going to be doing all that?
No.
No. Okay.
So to the extent there is anything budgeted in professional services or contract services, which is not part of the personnel side of the box,
Okay.
it's part of the materials and supplies, that's what we call it. That would be there. So any contracted position is not going to be part of personnel.
Did I miss the breakdown for the contract employees that we have then? Or is that not included?
They should be, they're in the budget schedules, aren't they? Contract, it's usually under
But
professional
not
services,
by- not by me.
but it's under a line item,
Yeah,
professional service.
Yes.
We either use professional services or contract services in individual department budgets like planning and community development and services and building. So if you see a line item that says professional services, that's usually where our contractors are, their allocation for their budget is.
And that's within the general fund cost breakdown or the?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes.
And so all of those would be lumped into one category of professional services.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay.
In each department, most of these departments, building and community development and services, they have, and finance have, and my department, I think too, right, has, no? Okay.
That
finance-
information might be in this packet that was on the dais as we came in,
Is it in
or
the-
the dais.
The line item is in there, yes.
listed as
Okay.
professional
Yeah,
services?
yeah.
Okay,
what it
so
was
I
called.
should
Yep.
be able to find that in
Yes.
here.
Yep.
Thank you. Second question is under taxes on your general fund expenditure detail. And again, we got this just this
Yep.
evening. In here, you have taxes. I'm assuming under taxes, which is projected for 23-24, a little over $4 million. That includes TOT tax, property tax, and sales tax, all 3 of those taxes.
That's all, yeah, all the taxes are, let me pull up the schedule so that we're talking apples and apples here.
It's on the 3rd page of
Yeah.
your packet, at
So
the very top.
your taxes, so you have a schedule in what you just got today, called General Fund Revenue Detail. Okay,
I have, okay, revenue and expenditure detail. I
now
have.
go to the next page, the very
Next
next page. Now that should say general,
Property tax, okay, very good. Thank
all
you.
the taxes are, anything that's rolling into that tax category is listed here.
Is, okay, so that page I was looking at is a recap.
Yep,
of
yep,
all the
yeah.
others. Thank you. I'm sorry I asked the question. We just got this, so thank you.
Okay.
I'm done, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Evan, did you have anything further?
No, no.
Okay, very good. Yeah, well, Andy, thank you once again for a very detailed financial report on the status of our city. You know, City of Willows, we have been and are a very fiscally conservative operation. Would you agree, Andy?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
We don't have.
Yeah, exactly, David. Exactly, David. And, you know, there were, in your, your very thorough, staff report and the information you provided, as well as your verbal report tonight. Thank you very much for your excellent work and for your professionalism and your knowledge. We're very fortunate, that we have you here, City of Willows. But, you know, I saw no surprises at all in your report. I expected all of this, including the unfortunate news with the CalBERS, unfunded liability coming down the horizon. Although we wiped all those, huge out of control costs out, with our pension obligation bond, about 3 years ago, which put us in very positive territory, but I knew they'd resurface and be back, although minimal. They're, that's frightening. You said that the CalPERS unfunded liability triggered at about 6.8% on their gains.
That's their
6.8%.
minimum requirement.
You're
That was
on
a
the
number. Yeah,
liability?
that was yeah. Did you say 6.8%?
They need to earn 6.8% on
right,
their
right,
portfolio. Yeah,
right.
for us to break even.
What's the CalPERS projection on their earnings for for the future?
For, well, hopefully 6.8%. I mean, that's
Do-
that's
are-
what they'll tell you.
On their forecasting, do they forecast those earnings as well, the percentage?
Right now, they're probably pretty close to that.
Okay,
And that's just educated guess right
Sure.
now based on, what I've seen in their reports and everything so far. This year, hopefully they make it. But
Sure.
again, it just,
And I think I mentioned to you that, before, and Andy and I talked about this at length, that, the CalPERS board is, become very political and is making some very political investments and choices that don't necessarily result in the best return on investment for the city or the employee.
absolutely.
And so unfortunately, the city becomes a casualty to that when they are not treating CalPERS like a retirement, pension system, just focused on really getting the best for your clients and your customers, and that's not what's happening.
That's correct.
So.
Yeah.
It's really disturbing.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Marty, for not only the council's benefit, but for public, our citizens' benefit. Because the CalPERS Board of Directors has been doing the entire state of California, all municipal agencies, entities within California, an extreme disservice over the last many years going political. Their job is to sustain the CalPERS pension system. That's their job. That's their job. They have not been doing that. They've been playing politics and choosing, making poor choices in reference to investments and not investing in what they should be investing in, as well as some very poor real estate investments that they've made over the past several years. It's a crying shame. It's sad. And it's nothing that just started a year or two ago. It's been going on for several years now. And it costs all of us a lot of money. It costs our citizens a lot of money. This is absolutely insane. And that needs to stop at some point. So thank you for, that's all I'll get off my soapbox now on that, but it's just,
Well, just to add more soap to the soapbox, at the Municipal Finance Institute that Andy and Joanne and myself all attended, I was pretty taken aback when the presenter said that last year they invested $500 million in climate change related investments, and this year they're going to do $1 billion. And that certainly is part of the area where they lost money. So.
well, absolutely. Well, now that you mentioned that, tobacco is one thing they peeled back on. Tobacco is a lawful subsidized product in the United States. And the investments do well.
Mhm.
And CalPERS doesn't invest in it. That's just one of many, many examples, but I won't expand on that, but thank you. I
Good
just
one.
wanted to.
Yeah.
They do
Sure.
invest in China, however.
They do. Yes, Forrest, they do.
No.
Yes, it's insane.
I agree.
Anyway, so I feel better now. So CalPERS should send me a bill for the therapy. Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Correct.
Yeah, when CalPERS loses, we have to pay the difference.
Yes.
That's correct.
Oh, it's
exactly
terrible.
right.
It's, yeah. But I feel better now. So thank you. But you know what? We'll go to public comment in a minute and feel free to come on up and state what you like to state. So the record catches it. So, okay. All right. You're welcome. You're welcome. I'm almost finished. But, I just wanted to touch on the fact that, we are a fiscally conservative operation, and sales tax measure is the only way out right now, a sales tax measure increase. Nearly every surrounding community, municipality, city And some counties have done the same thing, and others are moving that direction. I believe right now, with the exception of, Marty, help me out here, the exception of Yuba City and Reading, are those about the?
Those were the two, yeah, and Yuba
Only-
City is planning to go out again this year. They
Okay.
say they desperately need it. They can't not.
Yuba City's
have
going in.
an
They're the only
exception.
two jurisdictions within our region that,
Within an hour of Willows.
that doesn't have
one.
a sales tax measure in effect for these very same reasons. We're, you know, we're
Reading's
all-
got their own revenue sources. They're
Correct.
rich.
The power plant.
They
I
have
think
power,
that's a
yeah,
big
power
power.
Reading Power Authority.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So anyway, no, but, yeah, and, that's a topic coming up, next, but you know, Rick was saying that, I mean, you know, unfortunately, that's our only way out, but the good news is if, when we discuss that topic, and if that is ultimately enacted, and hopefully it will be, we utilize that money. That money comes to City of Willows to provide the basic services to our citizens that we have a duty to provide: public safety, public infrastructure, health and safety. In reference to public infrastructure, I'm talking about, you know, everything that Public Works does, everything that law enforcement does, and everything that fire department does. Those are our basic services. We're very fortunate to have other great services. Joni Mays are very capable and outstanding library directors here. We have a great library. Our services across the board, library, fire, community development, they're top notch. And right now we're limping along very effectively with a part-time recreation manager who is tendered her resignation, unfortunately, but I understand. And we'll have a discussion on that, you know, on that matter at upcoming meeting. But yeah, you know, that's, I agree, Rick. I mean, that's our only way out of this right now, unfortunately. But yeah, that's the, you know, that's the financial status of the city. So once again, Andy, thank you very much for that. I don't have, I have no further questions. And I'll stop harping on that now. And before we move on with the action item, public comment, sir, feel free to approach a mic if you have any public comment in reference to this matter. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, please, that way it
This way it gets recorded.
captures, the audio captures.
He's our
City
finance
clerk.
consultant.
He's our financial consultant, yes, yeah, yeah. Mhm. Sure, I'd be happy to, after the meeting tonight, if you have time, you have a few minutes after the meeting, I'll be happy to, yeah, I'd be happy to talk to you. Absolutely, yeah. You're welcome.
Chado, tell them the business you own in case they don't know.
Yeah.
Called.
Oh, very good.
Relatives
Oh, very
were-
good. Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for being here. Yeah, well, yeah, if you have time, sure, absolutely. Yeah, we'll chat. Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you very much for your comments. Any further public comment this evening? Mr. Ross, good evening. Good. Good to see you.
Thank you.
You broke it, Doug.
Right. That one was a red one and that was a green one, according to my vision. Now I can talk better. But what I was asking was in a model sort of sense, the city of Willows today was providing only the services of the municipal entity that's required by, law, what, kind of, percentage of the, revenues and or expenditures would be, what's rock bottom? The city of Willows could continue to exist, but X, Y, Z, and A, and C wouldn't be a service, but M, N, and L would because of the bargaining law.
So thank you, Doug. I understand.
Is that- you understand?
Yeah, your question is basically what percentage of city services are mandated?
That is right.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
Well,
Good question.
Are you?
That I was
looking at
actually
by
answered
budget?
earlier tonight. Yeah, Andy answered that, did you not? The services that are required that we provide, city manager, engineer.
Are you
Public
asking though, are you asking though, as a percentage of the budget, in terms of like a dollar amount or?
no, I'm not, I'm more a theoreticist. I don't know why I'm working for a newspaper that's a theoreticist, but let's just bypass that. But, let's say we're looking at Death Valley and founding a city there. And we're going to say, we need fire and rescue, we need police, we need water, and everybody can dig their own sewer sump pumps because they're not required. So if you really looked at it as a model city that that provided only what so-called law, which I presume be the federal and the state government and so forth, past practice and everything else, how low could you go? You don't, in other words, if, in a theoretical sense, if I came along and said, okay, you've got fire and police, but you don't need a library, you don't need sewer, but fire and police seem to need, be the only two things you would really need. Am I right?
Well,
Yeah.
you also need a building official, a city attorney, a finance department. Those things are needed. You need a planner. You have to have. Yeah.
Right, but from a theoretical standpoint, and I don't want to belabor it by saying, when the sales tax thing goes before the public, the questions the public asks are very sort of elementary, shall we say. They're not up there in budget complexity or policy complexity. So I'm speaking kind of like a doofus, if you will, for the reasons not to make a doofus for the public, but to get real elemental about the question. So the question is, let's say I fulfilled all the roles you just mentioned that were necessary, but I was gonna do it for, $1 million. So we had police and we had fire and we had me doing everything else as a versatileist. Is that and then the city would continue to exist and people would fondly remember the days when there was a swimming pool and an economic development budget and all these different components of the budget. So I'm gonna kind of suspend, it should be a question that I'm at, public comment wise, suspended into a rhetorical framework rather than ask for an answer. When I analyze budgets, which I'm not that good at, but once again, I represent the public and a lot of people aren't good at it. It would be a reasonable question to ask, how elemental could you get and still be a city? That's the question, and don't require an answer this evening. I'd like to think of, with everything going the way that it is, it's almost like, you could have my Death Valley model, you could have a robotic city, it was run by no people, no staff expenses, the whole thing worked, this, the water work, the police and rescue work. I'm just gonna drop it at that. I'm trying to get to, what's really, when you say the word, the law requires, what does the law really require is my question, and I'm just gonna pose it as a question.
Yeah.
Just not without requiring. an
Okay.
answer.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Any further public comment tonight on this matter? Any further? Okay, no. Thank you very much for your input. We have one action item tonight, gentlemen, and it is consider approval of the mid-year budget review. Any questions, comments before we,
Would we also not be involved in, talking about sales tax measures?
we will.
Not
yeah.
tonight.
Our
that
next
be-
item up will be, discuss the general fund forecast and discuss a potential sales tax. Or,
Okay, so we're
action
gonna do
item
that in
tonight
two
is-
steps, okay.
yeah, action item, the only action item on tonight's agenda is consider approval of the mid-year budget review.
Mr. Mayor, I move that we approve the mid-year budget review and any recommended adjustments and discuss the general fund forecast update and potential sales tax measure.
Second. Mr. Vauden has, moved that we approve the mid-year budget review. Mr. Sprague has seconded. Is there further discussion?
All right, quick question, if I may.
Mr.
There
Thomas?
was discussion about the additional ARPA money that, and the police
Or the fire truck.
impact account. And is that, where do we sit with the moving the police? Is that built into this mid-year adjustment? Moving the money that's in the impact account for the police services?
It was a question whether or not the
Question, it's
council
not
wanted to
built
do
into
that.
this. It's
Right.
not- Okay.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it'll just sit there in the impact fund.
Same with the remaining ARPA funds?
They'll just sit there until
Yeah.
the council takes action. Yeah.
No further
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah, thank you. I had the same question, right? Yeah, very good. Okay. Any further, discussion? Okay, moving second on the floor. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Carries unanimously. Thank you. Okay, next up is a discussion of the general fund forecast update.
So just to clarify, I put all of that together because there are pieces of all of that in
Right.
Andy's presentation.
Very good.
And the sales tax, in particular, is an agenda item explicit next week at regular session for the council to discuss and give any direction. Probably include a couple of Andy's slides again as attachments. Councilmember Baden suggested that I also include the list of cities that have sales tax. If you remember, I did a presentation some time ago in the region. Add that as an attachment and just have it be a formal discussion, action, potential action item, but really it's to seek direction. The city attorney will not be here next week. The deputy city attorney, Sean, will be here. So the soonest I would want to bring anything back, if the council so desires, would be the February 13th meeting, but we do need some sort of direction on what that is we'd be bringing back. So that's next week's discussion, for the council. Of course, you can also discuss it right now too.
Yeah, very good. Very good, Marty. Thank you. Gentlemen? Discussion? Reference the next, the agenda item for the next meeting that Ms.
Well-
Brown was talking about.
If I may just throw it out for the public's consideration as well as the council. If we were to look at a 1.5% sales tax, should we consider perhaps a sunset 10 years down the road as an example? And obviously not for immediate discussion, but we'll ultimately need to identify where and how we're gonna, that money that we raise through a sales tax would go and be spent. So we could adequately share with the public where we're gonna go.
Sure.
So just for us to think about for next week.
Very good, Rick. Thank you.
You're not, if I could just clarify, are you suggesting that a special tax then? You want to actually, list out, I wouldn't recommend a special tax. Because
No, I'm talking about sales tax.
We don't have to do it under this particular provision. Is that not correct?
you do, with the general sales tax, you don't have to say how you're going to spend it and.
Well, I
so-
know we don't have to, but I think in order to properly identify to our citizens, we need to have at least some summary of, obviously, this identifies where we need to spend the money, majority. But we're also lagging in recreation and some other things that sales tax would generate and provide services.
I'd
So
like
I
to
think we need
comment
be
on
able
that
to
if I
Identify
can.
those for our public, for our voting public.
Yeah, Councilmember Thomas, just from my perspective, that's probably a good idea. I will tell you that in the city of Grass Valley, there is a transactions and use tax. It used to be called Measure N that was implemented maybe 10 years ago. And it was a 1/2 cent sales tax. 3 years before that was supposed to expire because it had a sunset on it. We actually went out and had Measure E that changed it from 1/2 cent to 1 cent with no sunset requirement on it. Okay. And essentially, one of the things that helped really sell that tax is the fact that, number one, we made it a general tax because general taxes only require 50% as opposed to a special designated tax that requires 2/3.
Right.
Okay. But we have what's called a Measure E, and we had a Measure N committee as well. And what that is each council member gets to designate a member of their choosing to be part of a group of individuals that form an ad hoc committee of the council that is actually a Brown Act committee. And they meet periodically. They meet when we do the budget. And they meet when we talk about mid-year. They meet when we need something special. Because our Measure E can only be used for police, fire, streets, and parks. Okay, those 4 things. Okay, and that's what we told the public. Even though it's a general tax, we told the public that this is what we're going to use it for. So Measure E is kind of they're not, and they don't make decisions or anything like that. Ultimately, that's the purview of the council. But they do meet with us, and we're very diligent about making sure that we meet with them so that they can go over everything and then basically bless whatever staff is bringing forward to the city council for use of those Measure E funds. So those types of things do work. And they buy a lot of buy-in from the community as well. I will tell you that firsthand.
And look, you're done. If you,
Yes.
I want to piggyback on that then. So what you're describing in your Measure E, as opposed to a special tax, it was still a general tax, which kept it to a 50% vote as opposed to a 2/3 vote. But you still specified only what you could spend it on.
Well, we only spend it on certain things. Now, having said that, because it's a general tax, it can be spent on anything. Okay,
Sounds like a
So-
marketing
okay.
that's the
ploy.
bottom line,
So-
but our city doesn't do that. Okay,
So the
Bait
council
switch.
could make a policy decision that they want to only spend it on certain things and not make it part of the actual ballot measure language. I would caution that we, certainly want to have the conversation with the city attorney and be very careful about the ballot language wording, because I happen to know that in Yuba County, where I live, when they put a 1 cent county tax, sales tax on the ballot, it got challenged. And one of the reasons it got challenged was because of the way the wording was. The challengers suggested that it implied it was a special sales tax. And so and then it went back, it got upheld and then it went on to appeal. And so, we want to make sure, however, the council wants to approach it, that the ballot language is, legal and will stand up in court in terms of being a general sales tax and not a special sales.
Can't hear you.
Does this one work? Yeah. I think what Mr. Heath is describing is exactly what Orland did with their sales tax. Measure A is a general sales tax. But they said that the goal of it was to fund fire, law enforcement, public works. But technically the council, if they wanted to put money, I think they had some issues a few months or with the few members of their last council that specified they wanted to use that money for something else. And it didn't get used for something else, but it could have if they could have swayed the rest of the council.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Chief. Anything further, Mr. Sprague?
Well, yes, I would like to also add into the discussion when we talk about this, what we discussed one time before. And Evan was the one that corrected my language on it, I think, and the city attorney agreed. Alternatives that we could be, or not alternatives to the sales tax, additional items that we could do to the sales tax. You're bringing up economic development. I concur 100%. I think Rick would probably concur. All of us would probably concur with that. So to not just leave these other additional things out of the mix that we could start discussing in there as well. Okay, and not just focus on how do we present the sales tax where it's quote unquote palatable to the people.
Thank you. Rick, anything further?
No.
Oh, yes. You ready?
David, yes.
Yes,
Rick.
so just want to repeat that what we need based on this financial midterm report and the prognosis going forward is a general sales tax. That the process of producing a percent approval document for a general sales tax is what we need. And that when we talk about structuring it, that is a separate issue. And the Measure E was a policy statement, not a condition of the sales tax, wherein they stated to the public that that particular council under this policy had a predilection, if you will, or intention to spend it in certain ways. Forrest makes a good point. There are so many things that we need to do that that inhibiting, limiting, making that sales tax less palatable by trying to define it, it would be just terrible. So it's two separate steps: one sales tax general, and then marketing it to the public so that they realize we're doing it for their benefit and how they will benefit and why it's necessary and all of the righteous things that should get it passed. So I just want to make sure that we keep that dialogue separate, because it gets confusing. And I will say to my good friend, Mr. Thomas, that a sunset clause to me is disingenuous, because there's no likely way in the world at some number of years down the road that we will need less money. So selling it on the basis of claiming you're going to lower it, as you said in your example, where you basically just redesigned it and got more, I would not be in favor of a sunset clause. I think it's disingenuous. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flood. Fred?
I hate taxes. I'd be the first to admit that. And yes, I think everyone agrees with that. So what I would like to see, and I agree with what Forrest is bringing up as well, I would agree with the sunset clause idea, to where it doesn't necessarily get rid of the tax, but it does lower it. It's not legally an emergency, but it's essentially an emergency for our city. I believe that we do need the 1.5%. However, I would hope that us having that for, let's say 5 years, would get us into a spot to where we can start with the economic growth side of growing our city, to where we're hopefully producing new businesses are wanting to come to town. We're able to draw in other sources of income rather than taxing the people that live here. So I would like to see a sales tax with a sunset into the tax lowering, so we're not hindering, our citizens as much, as well as hopefully looking at the economic growth. I know Forrest in the past has brought up the idea of selling some of our properties. Not a huge fan of that. I know there's maybe some other options for them as well. Not quite sure what those would be, whether we're able to do a long-term leases to people to build on them to where we don't lose the property for years to come if we do need future development, as a way to hold on to the properties that we do own as a city, but not doing a sale where we may not get necessarily the best price for them as well. But obviously we do need a way to balance our budget right now. And unfortunately, for the short term, that's a sales tax. For the long term, hopefully that's more businesses, that's, restaurants hopefully wanting to come into the town, more grocery stores, other services that want to come in. Hopefully piggybacking on what the town already has to offer, which is a racetrack outside town, huge duck hunting community, different things like that. So hopefully the city is able to grow, but I would not want to see necessarily a 1.5% sales tax where we're telling people you're paying this forever, at this rate, because really this rate's to get us hopefully out of the red and into the black, to where we're able to get ourselves to a point where we're self-sufficient without relying on taxing the people that we're trying to serve. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hudson. Yeah, I agree with much of what I've heard here. So I'd like to see Andy, you've already laid it out for us in excellent detail tonight on what the projections with a 1%, a 1.25%, and a 1.5% sales tax measure would look like. I'd like to see all of those included in the discussion, the 1.25 and the 1.5%. if possible. And I think, it, I think you probably have your consensus from the council, and we're asking for quite a big pie to look at our next agenda and discuss all these different topics that have been brought up tonight. I think they're all very viable points.
Well, since this, I mean, Andy's included a slide around the sales tax to get you thinking about it. You all received an email from me a few weeks ago with the same sort of, to start stimulating thought about it, because I know that this is it's a big deal. It's a big move. It's big change, big choices. But it's also not an explicit agenda item tonight, but it will be next week. And I will include in the staff report the various elements that I heard tonight, but it's going to be really next week because it's an explicit agenda item seeking direction. It's going to be your chance to try to bring all of you together with, one sense of direction that's, that then I can work with the city attorney to bring back ballot language, hopefully by
Understood.
the 13th. So,
Mm.
I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm going to try to put it into some kind of staff report that is clear and articulate with all your different choices that are ahead of you to make. And then I guess we'll see where it goes next week.
And we will have extensive discussion on
I'm
those
sure you will.
topics.
Yeah.
Yes, we will.
Marty, is there a chance, I don't know if the council agrees with this or not, is there a chance that you could look into how your measures that you were discussing were put on your ballot? Way back when is there a way to look those up from,
Like,
when they were-
how do you mean how they're?
well,
playing?
how it was when they voted for you said Measure H, I'm sorry. Measure E, I'm sorry. When they voted on your Measure E, is there a way to see how that was actually posted on the ballot when they voted for that?
I can probably dig that up.
Okay.
Did
I didn't,
they,
and like I said, I was
Did they
just,
use a consultant? draft that?
I just didn't know, because you're talking about making sure that it's legal, so we don't have to worry about, litigation or anything like that.
Well, the city
And-
attorney will work on the language.
yeah.
They have a sales tax specialist that
Okay.
worked on the last ballot language.
Yeah.
Didn't go forward.
And we just want to make sure, that it reads well for the citizens to understand it and, and I'm all for if there wants to be a secondary ad hoc committee to oversee us, or help guide us, I think another small pool of people wouldn't hurt.
Oh, if you recall, the previous proposed,
I believe
Sales
something like
tax
that was
measure
in there, right?
from November did have an ad hoc committee
Yep.
that was actually made up of members of the public,
Mhm.
what was recommended in that, language.
Yes.
ballot language.
Yeah.
Yes,
And I still agree with that. I still think that's a good idea.
And other cities do a report, Marysville and also Vallejo both do quarterly reports specifically on the sales tax and how it's been spent. Neither of them have an oversight committee, so there is more than one way to do this and be successful.
Yeah, and I'm just looking for good ways to, make sure that we keep people's trust,
And
We're a
actually-
newer committee and, we want to make sure that we are keeping their trust with us and not overstepping any lines, so.
Yeah, and actually in Grass Valley, we have a separate fund. So there's a fund that's created just for Major E money. So anything it's all separated by the state, so you know what's Major E and what's not.
Right.
When it comes in, we put all the money in that fund, and then we align the staff members that are charged to that fund directly into the fund. We align the capital purchases, that we align all the capital projects for streets, parks, et cetera, right out of that fund. So,
And Vallejo does the same thing.
I think personally, as a citizen, I would love to see something like that to where I know where that tax dollar is going. And making sure it's not being spent, frivolously or, it's actually being looked after. So,
But it sounds like that's the rub that was referred to as it's a policy statement, not cast of concrete, as it were. So it's one thing if another council comes up and says, oh, I think I'd rather spend it on whatever they want to spend.
Correct. You're right. We can only go so far with it, but at that point, the citizens do have the option of saying, I don't like that city council member being in that seat. That's misallocating our funds. So,
And you can
we have a
also-
duty to respond to the citizens as well.
I mean, the
people that
council
bring
can
those.
also decide to, I think goes to kind of what Andy was saying, literally, as budget season approaches and you have 2 or 3 budget workshops, you bifurcate and separate out the sales tax as a separate budget exercise that the council does with staff. I mean, we did that in Vallejo, every year I was on the council. It's a good process because you really get to see the difference it's making in that 1 or 1.5 cent sales tax in your city, how you're making choices to spend it. So I think that's just like another layer of, translucentness that we could add to the process. Looking for a new word.
See-through.
No, I agree. And Andy mentioned we'd had a previous discussion on these very topics. I absolutely agree with Evan. And Andy's recommendation also, or comments on a separate line item and definitely an advisory committee. And I do like to see that part of the discussion as well. One council member, one appointment sounds like a very fair approach to me as an advisory committee,
Mhm.
oversight committee, advisory committee. So very good. That'll all be included in our agenda item in our upcoming meeting. Okay.
Yeah, it sounds like I should also include a copy as an attachment of the prior ballot language that we reviewed back in October, November this year. Probably want a
Very
copy
good.
of that as well.
Yeah,
Very
absolutely.
yes.
Thank you, Marty.
Mr. Mayor, I have a quick question that
Mr.
maybe
Sprague.
Andy can answer. In looking at the actual breakdown of these taxes, where you project sales taxes of 1,500,000 some odd thousand and change. The next line item for income is property taxes at $1,081,000. I think I just did the math on what I paid for my property taxes, and I think for the city-owned property was a little over $8,400, which obviously goes to the county, which then the county sends it to the state. How much of that actually comes percentage-wise would come back to us?
That's a great question.
Okay.
Thank you for asking that question, because what happens is a lot of people believe that when they pay their property tax bill in any given jurisdiction, that all that money goes to that jurisdiction.
Right.
And that is truly not the case. Property taxes are distributed based on what's called a TRA, which is a tax rate area. And that tax rate area is essentially based on something from 1978 that was put in place when Prop 13, at the same time Prop 13 came into existence, where AB 8 essentially solidified the distribution of taxes at the time when somebody paid a property tax in any given home, any given parcel, whatever portion of the property taxes were received by any jurisdiction supporting that parcel. It's not just the city, it's the city, it's the county, it's the cemetery district, it's all the school districts, from the junior college school district all the way down to the elementary school district. It's sometimes a water district, it's a fire district to the extent you have that. Anybody that was receiving a portion of that 1% ad valorem tax that everybody has to pay in California, in 1978, those AB 8 factors were solidified, okay? And typically from any city to any city, barring any annexation, tax sharing agreements with counties or anything like that, the average percentage that any city receives is between 16 and 20%. So I would
16
garner to say that of the $8,400 you paid in an ad valorem tax, assuming it was all ad valorem and not special assessments for sewer or bonds or anything like that, of the ad valorem portion, that $8,400, this city received probably 16 to 20%.
Okay,
that.
good to know. And the reason I'm asking that is with the idea that I've inventoried the amount of vacant properties that we've got that are buildable, not only what the city owns, but the rest of them. So I'm kind of projecting and saying, okay, if a house, a typical 1,600 square foot house with a $395,000 sales price, et cetera, what would that empty lot now generate with a house on it?
Yeah, so it'd be 4,000 times about 16%,
About 16%.
which would be 600, 700 bucks.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. Perfect answer. Appreciate it.
Any further questions, comments?
Move to
Council
adjourn.
This evening? Anything further? Okay, Andy, Marty, anything further? Well, very good. Thank you very much for an excellent report. Okay. Good discussion. Looking forward to the next meeting. Time is 8:05 PM and this meeting is adjourned. Have a good night.